By the third time my manager called it my rollout model, I stopped pretending I had misunderstood him. I was sitting 2 seats away from Mark in a conference room at the client's regional office, with a notebook open in front of me because officially I was there to take implementation notes. On the screen behind him was a 12-slide proposal I had spent most of the previous 3 weeks rebuilding. The site readiness grid was mine. The staffing sequence was mine. The contingency rules were mine. Even the little red, amber, and green boxes Mark was pointing to had started as a messy table in my spreadsheet after I realized the original rollout schedule would put 2 understaffed locations into transition on the same Monday. Mark clicked to the next slide. What I wanted to avoid, he said, was treating every site as if it carried the same operational risk. I looked down at my notebook. What I wanted to avoid. Not what we wanted to avoid. Not what Erin identified. What I wanted. Across the table, Denise Harper, the client's regional facilities director, nodded and made a note. I wrote down nothing. 3 weeks earlier, I would have told you Mark was the best manager I had ever worked for. That is the embarrassing part. I was 27, still junior enough that every decent assignment felt like somebody opening a door for me. I worked in operations for a facilities services company, which meant most of my job involved making sure the promises other people made could actually happen. Sales could say we would transition 11 healthcare offices in 60 days. Operations had to figure out whether 11 offices could actually be transitioned in 60 days without people missing shifts, supplies arriving at the wrong sites, or a clinic manager calling at 7 in the morning because nobody had shown up. I liked that part. Not the crisis calls, I could live without those. I liked taking something vague and making it specific enough that people could act on it. Mark knew that. He also knew I wanted to move into an operations specialist role. I had never directly asked him to recommend me for one. I thought asking would make me look impatient. That was one of my problems back then. I thought ambition was acceptable only if nobody could see it. So I tried to be useful instead. Useful people got trusted. Trusted people got opportunities. That was the equation I had built in my head. When the healthcare account came up, Mark called me into his office on a Tuesday morning and turned his monitor toward me. "We need the rollout section cleaned up," he said. I looked at the document. It was not a rollout section. It was 4 slides containing dates, arrows, and phrases like site readiness confirmation. I asked, "Who's doing the readiness assessment?" Mark leaned back. "That's part of what I need you to help shape." That should have been my first clue that cleanup meant figure out. Instead, I was thrilled. The account mattered. 11 locations was larger than anything I had worked on directly, and the client had made it clear they were nervous about changing vendors while their offices remained open. Mark told me the presentation was in 3 weeks. "Don't overbuild it," he said. "We just need something credible." I said, "Got it." Then I overbuilt it. Not because Mark demanded it, because I wanted him to see what I could do. The original schedule assumed we could move through the sites geographically, starting north and working south. That looked efficient until I compared it with staffing. 2 of the northern sites depended on the same floating support team. A third location had a local supervisor leaving midway through the transition window. One site could tolerate after-hours setup, another could not because of building access restrictions. The plan was neat on a map and terrible in real life. I showed Mark the conflict during our Friday check-in. He glanced at the spreadsheet and said, "So what are you recommending?" That question made my entire week. Not what did you find? What are you recommending? I told him I thought we needed to rank sites by readiness instead of geography. Show me. So I did. I built a simple scoring system. Staffing stability. Access constraints. Dependency on shared support crews. Time needed to recover if something went wrong. I kept it basic because the last thing I wanted was a system nobody could explain without a manual. Red meant we did not move the site until a specific risk was resolved. Amber meant we could proceed with a contingency. Green meant normal transition. Mark stared at the screen for a few seconds. "This is good." I wish I could pretend I reacted modestly. I did not. I carried that sentence around for days. "This is good." Every time he sent another change, I answered quickly. When he asked me to tighten the staffing slide, I did it that afternoon. When he wanted the language simplified for the client, I rewrote it. When he said the site sequence needed to look more executive-friendly, I reorganized the whole section. Leo Ramirez, one of our implementation coordinators, gave me several staffing numbers and watched the document grow from 4 vague slides into an actual operating plan. One afternoon, he stopped beside my desk. "You know you're basically building the implementation now." I kept typing. "That's the idea." "No. I mean, does Mark know that?" I looked at him. He assigned it to me. Leo gave me the kind of look people give you when they think you answered a different question. Then he said, "Okay," and walked away. I remember being irritated with him. I thought he was being cynical. Mark was my manager. Of course he knew I was doing the work. He was the one giving me feedback. And Mark did give feedback. That became important later, because I did not want to rewrite history and pretend he contributed nothing. He changed the order of 2 slides. He told me which client concerns had come up during sales discussions. He cut a section I had made too detailed. He also pushed me to explain the staffing fallback in simpler language, and he was right about that. But the structure underneath it was mine. I knew every ugly version that had existed before the clean one. The Monday before the presentation, Mark stopped at my desk around 4:30. "How close are we?" "Basically done." "Send me the clean final version tonight." I nodded. He added, "Not the working one. I don't want comments and half-finished notes floating around." That sounded reasonable. There was a project email thread I could have used. Denise was not on it, but our internal account team was. Leo was. Mark's director was. I could have sent the file there and written something simple. Final implementation model attached. I incorporated the site risk and staffing changes we discussed. That would not have been aggressive. It would not have been territorial. It would have been normal. Instead, I sent the deck directly to Mark at 7:14 that evening. Made the changes. Should be ready to present. That was it. No explanation of what I had built. No list of decisions. No mention of ownership. I even removed my initials from 2 draft slides because I thought leaving them there looked amateur. I was desperate to seem easy. Easy to manage. Easy to trust. Easy to promote. The next morning, Mark messaged me. "Looks strong. Nice work." I smiled at my phone like an idiot. On presentation day, he asked me to come along. "You know the detail better than anyone," he said. "It'll be useful to have you there for notes and follow-up." Again, I heard what I wanted to hear. "You know the detail better than anyone." I did not hear the other half. For notes and follow-up. The client meeting started normally. Mark handled introductions. I was introduced as Erin from operations. Not junior operations analyst. Not the person who developed the rollout. Just Erin from operations. That did not bother me at first. There were 7 people in the room, and nobody needed my resume. Mark walked through the account structure, staffing commitments, and service standards. Then he reached the implementation section. My section. He clicked onto the readiness grid. "One thing I built into the rollout," he said, "is a risk-based sequencing model." I looked at him. It was such a small sentence that for a moment I wondered if I was overreacting. Managers say "I" when they mean their team. People simplify things in presentations. Maybe he would mention me on the next slide. He did not. He moved into the staffing sequence. The reason I moved us away from a geographic transition is that it creates the wrong dependencies. I felt heat climb up the back of my neck. Denise asked, "Was geography the original approach?" Mark said, "Initially, yes. Once I mapped the staffing constraints, I didn't think it was responsible." I stared at the red box beside Site 4. I had found that conflict on a Thursday night after Leo sent me an updated support schedule. Mark had never mapped it. He had asked me what the red box meant the next morning. I could have corrected him. There was space. Not much, but enough. I could have said, "That came out of the staffing analysis I ran with Leo." It would even have sounded natural. Instead, I said nothing. Because the client meeting was going well. Because we wanted the account. Because Mark was still my manager after everyone left that room. and because some part of me was still trying to make what he was doing smaller than it was. Maybe he was nervous. Maybe this was just presentation language. Maybe afterward he would tell Denise I had built the underlying model. Then Mark reached the next slide. My rollout framework gives us a way to make those calls without improvising under pressure. There it was again. I looked at his face. He was completely comfortable. That bothered me more than if he had stumbled over it. He was not stealing a line in a moment of panic. He had settled into the story. Across from him, Denise studied the readiness grid. She had barely touched the coffee somebody had brought her. She kept moving her pen between the staffing schedule and the site sequence, comparing them. Then she stopped. She tapped one of the amber sites with the end of her pen. I have a question about this. Mark smiled. Sure. Denise looked at the screen, then back at him. What happens if 2 sites hit the same risk level in the same week, but you only have 1 floating support crew available? My stomach dropped. I knew that question. Not approximately, not generally. I knew exactly why she was asking it. Because I had spent 40 minutes trying to solve that exact problem 2 weeks earlier. Mark looked at the slide. For the first time since he started presenting my work, he did not immediately have something to say. Mark kept looking at the slide. Not for long. Maybe 2 seconds. But I knew him well enough to recognize what he was doing. He was searching for language, not the answer. Language that might sound like the answer. He nodded once. In that scenario, we'd use managerial discretion based on the severity of the risk. Denise did not move. What determines severity? Mark glanced at the grid again. There are a few variables. I could see his eyes move across the categories. Staffing stability. Access constraints. Shared crew dependency. Recovery time. All the labels were there. The rule was not. Denise asked, which variable wins? Mark gave a small smile. It depends on the operational context. That was exactly the kind of sentence he used when he wanted to sound cautious without committing to anything. Normally, it worked. Denise leaned back slightly. I understand that, but your plan is supposed to stop people from improvising when 2 sites compete for the same resources. She pointed at the screen. So if both are amber on Monday morning, who gets the crew? Nobody spoke. I looked down at my notebook. The answer was simple because I had made it simple. Patient-facing disruption first, then anything tied to a regulatory or access dependency, then recovery time. If one location could absorb a 1-day delay without affecting critical service, that location moved. We had tested it against 4 possible conflicts. I had even built a small decision table in the working version of the deck before Mark told me it was too detailed for the client presentation. He turned toward me. Erin, why don't you walk Denise through how we're handling that? There are moments where you imagine you will feel one clear emotion. Anger, satisfaction, fear. I felt all 3, and none of them were useful. Every person at that table looked at me. I could have made Mark look ridiculous. It would not have required much. I could have said, sure. When I designed the model, I built a priority sequence for exactly that situation. 1 sentence. Completely true. I knew how it would sound. I also knew what would happen afterward. Maybe Denise would notice. Maybe Mark would stumble. Maybe somebody from our account team would ask questions. And then we would still have to finish the meeting. Still have to win the work. Still have to sit in the same office the next morning. So I looked at Denise instead of Mark. If 2 sites land at the same risk level, we don't treat the color as the final decision. She picked up her pen again. I continued. The first priority is patient-facing disruption. So if delaying 1 site could interfere with normal clinic operations, and the other can stay stable for another day, the crew goes to the first site. Denise nodded. Okay. After that, we look at fixed dependencies. Building access, required clearances, things that can't simply be moved to Wednesday because we'd lose the window. And if those are equal, recovery time. That got her attention. I leaned slightly toward the screen. 2 sites can have the same score and still have very different consequences if we delay them. If Site 4 can recover from a 24-hour shift with no service impact, but Site 7 loses 2 days because of how its setup has to be sequenced. Site 7 gets the crew. Denise looked at the chart. So you're prioritizing consequence, not just risk. Yes. She made another note. That makes more sense. I heard someone on our side of the table shift in their chair. Mark said, exactly. That's the logic behind the framework. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because for half a second I genuinely could not believe he had said it. Exactly. As if I had just expanded on his answer. Denise was still looking at me. Who makes that call on the day? That question was harder. Not because I did not know the intended answer. Because the answer exposed a weakness in our current setup. The implementation lead would make the recommendation, I said. But for anything that changes a client-facing schedule, the client contact would confirm before we move resources. Denise nodded slowly. And who is your implementation lead? Mark answered this one immediately. We'll assign that once the transition schedule is finalized. That was true. Technically. It was also the first time during the presentation that the lack of an assigned lead seemed strange to me. I had been building rules for a person who did not officially exist yet. Denise asked me 2 more questions. One about a location that could not allow setup crews inside during normal clinic hours. One about what happened if a supervisor vacancy remained open past the planned transition date. I answered both. Mark stepped back in when the conversation moved to reporting cadence. I went back to taking notes. But the meeting had changed. Nothing dramatic happened. Nobody accused anyone. Nobody looked at Mark and said, wait, did she build this? It was subtler than that. Before Denise asked that first question, every question about the rollout went to Mark. Afterward, some of them came to me. Not all. Enough. At one point, Denise asked, Erin, would you want the local site managers involved in the readiness call, or just regional leadership? Would you want? I noticed Mark notice it. He answered before I could. We'll probably keep the early calls small. Denise looked at him. Then back at me. I said, for the first review, small is probably better. Once we're within 2 weeks of a site transition, I'd bring the local manager in. Otherwise, we'll be making assumptions about access and staffing that they can correct in 5 minutes. Denise nodded. Agreed. Mark clicked to the next slide. The rest of the meeting went smoothly. That almost made everything worse. If the presentation had failed, I could have told myself the credit did not matter because the work had not been good enough. Instead, the client liked the plan. They liked the sequencing. They liked the readiness model. They liked the escalation process. By the time we left, Denise had asked for a revised implementation calendar and a follow-up working session the next week. In the elevator, nobody said much. There were 5 of us from our company. Mark, me, our account director, Sheila, 1 person from sales, and a finance manager who had joined remotely for part of the meeting and spent the elevator ride answering messages on his phone. Sheila looked at me. Nice job in there. Thanks. That staffing answer was helpful. Before I could respond, Mark said, yeah, Erin knows the detail cold. It sounded like praise. That was what made it difficult. He was not openly dismissing me. He was putting me back into the role he had assigned me. Detail. He owned the framework. I knew the detail. I said, I spent a lot of time on the exception logic. Mark looked at me. Just briefly. Which is why it was good having you there. The elevator doors opened. That was the whole exchange. If you had been standing beside us, you probably would not have thought anything was wrong. By the time we got back to the office, I had convinced myself not to do anything impulsive. I had 3 possible reactions running through my head. Confront Mark immediately. Talk to Sheila. Pretend it did not matter. The third one was familiar. That was probably why it felt safest. I lasted until 4:10. Then Mark messaged me. Good work today. Come by when you have a minute. I waited 5 minutes before walking into his office because I did not want to arrive looking like I had been waiting for him to summon me. He was closing tabs on his monitor when I sat down. That went well, he said. Yeah. Denise seemed comfortable with the implementation approach. I watched him for a second. I kept waiting for him to say something about the presentation. He did not. So I did. When you presented the rollout section, you referred to the model as yours. He stopped moving his mouse. There. I had said it. No speech. No accusation. Just the sentence. Mark leaned back. Okay. I hated the word immediately. Not because it was rude. Because it made my concern sound like a strange observation he needed help interpreting. I said, it happened several times. I know what you mean. Then you know why I'm bringing it up. He exhaled through his nose and looked toward his office door. Erin, I don't think we need to make this bigger than it is. My face got hot again. I'm not trying to. We were presenting as a company. I understand that. I'm responsible for the account. I understand that too. He nodded, as if we were making progress. Then what's the concern? That irritated me enough that I finally stopped trying to make the conversation comfortable for him. The concern is that I built most of that model, and you repeatedly told the client that you built it. His expression changed. Not dramatically. He looked disappointed. That was worse than anger. Most of that model came out of conversations we had. Yes. And I assigned the work. Yes. And I reviewed it. Yes. He spread one hand. So I think saying I stole something from you is a pretty loaded interpretation. I didn't say stole. You're implying it. No, I'm saying what happened. Mark looked at me for a few seconds. Then he said, this is part of working on a team. I did not answer. When someone on my team produces good work, that reflects well on me. When they produce bad work, I own that too. I thought about the readiness model. I thought about the working draft he had barely opened until I condensed it into the presentation. I said, would you have said I built it if it had failed? That came out faster than I intended. His jaw tightened. That's not a useful question. It was the first moment I knew the conversation was not going anywhere. Not because he had no argument. Because he had one. He genuinely believed management changed the rules of ownership. I asked, what should I have said when Denise asked how the priority system worked? What you said. And if she had asked who designed it. He paused. I don't know. It depends on the context. There was that phrase again. Depends on the context. I looked at him. He added, look, you did well today. Really well. Don't undermine that by getting hung up on attribution. I remember that sentence almost word for word. Do not undermine your good work by caring who gets credit for your good work. At the time, I did not have a clever response. I just said, okay. He relaxed a little. I'm trying to get you more exposure, Erin. That hurt because I had believed him. Maybe part of me still did. I know. You're talented, but client leadership is different from building the analysis. There's a broader level of accountability. I understand. Good. I stood up. He said, and seriously, nice job with Denise. I left his office feeling worse than when I went in. If he had apologized, I would have known what happened. If he had yelled at me, I would have known what happened. Instead, he had taken something I thought was obviously wrong and explained it back to me as professional development. I went to the break room and found Leo standing at the counter waiting for the microwave. He looked at me once. What happened? Why does something have to happen? Because you're staring at a paper cup like it insulted you. I opened the cabinet. There were no clean mugs. I took a second paper cup. Mark presented the rollout as his. Leo stopped the microwave. Like his team's? His. He leaned against the counter. I told him what Mark had said in the meeting. Not every line. Just enough. Leo listened. Then he asked, did you say anything? Afterward. How'd that go? He said it was teamwork and he owns the account. Leo nodded slowly. That sounds like Mark. I looked at him. That's it? What do you want me to say? I don't know. Maybe that it's messed up? It is messed up. Thank you. But. I stared at him. He held up a hand. You're not going to like the but. Then maybe don't. You sent him the final deck, right? I said nothing. Directly? Yes. Did the project team get it? Not the final version. Did you put your name on the model? No. Did you ask who was presenting which section? No. He nodded again. I felt myself getting angry. So this is my fault? I didn't say that. It sounds like you're saying that. I'm saying Mark did what Mark does, and you gave him the cleanest possible opportunity to do it. I put the cup down harder than I needed to. That's basically blaming me. No. Blame means he gets less responsible because you made a mistake. He doesn't. The microwave beeped. Leo ignored it. But if you're asking me whether you made a mistake, yeah. I hated him for about 10 seconds. Mostly because I knew he was right. He continued. You act like wanting credit is embarrassing. I looked away. I don't. You do. No, I don't. Erin, you removed your initials from slides you built. They looked messy. He gave me a look. Okay, that shut me up. He finally opened the microwave. I asked, what am I supposed to do now? Leo stirred whatever he had reheated and shrugged. That depends what you want. I want him not to take credit for my work. That's not an outcome you control. I folded my arms. You're incredibly helpful. I'm serious. He looked at me. Do you want an apology? Do you want senior leadership to know? Do you want to run the implementation? Do you want to transfer teams? Those are different problems. I had no answer. Because until then, my entire reaction had been built around Mark admitting I was right. I wanted him to say he should have credited me. I wanted him to say he should have credited me. I wanted him to say he should have credited me. Leo picked up his food. For what it's worth, everyone who worked on that plan knows you built the ugly parts. The ugly parts? The useful parts. That's not better. It's a little better. He started toward the door, then stopped. One more thing. What? Don't do 12 people on an email tomorrow with a fake friendly correction. I wasn't going to. You were thinking about it. I was. He left. That evening, I reopened the project folder. Not because I had decided to collect evidence. I did not start downloading emails or building some case against Mark. I just wanted to look at the work again. The early staffing sheet. The first version of the site matrix. The decision table Mark had asked me to remove from the deck. I expected seeing it would make me angrier. Instead, it made me embarrassed. Not because Mark had presented it, because I had treated ownership like something immature people cared about. I had assumed good work would somehow carry my name with it. Like authorship was obvious. It was not obvious. Work moved through companies constantly. People revised it, presented it, summarized it, built on it. If you never said what you had done, eventually somebody else would. I still did not know what I wanted to do about Mark. But for the first time, I understood that staying silent was also a decision. The next morning, I did one small thing differently. Sheila asked me for the updated implementation calendar. Normally, I would have sent it to Mark first and waited for him to pass it along. Instead, I replied on the existing project thread. I attached the calendar and wrote, I updated the sequence based on the readiness model and Denise's questions yesterday. I also added the conflict priority logic we discussed, so the implementation team has the decision rules in one place. No accusation. No speech about credit. Just an accurate description of my work. Mark replied 20 minutes later. Thanks, Erin. That was all. I thought maybe the situation would settle there. Then, just after lunch, Sheila forwarded a message from Denise. There were 6 questions about implementation. 4 were normal. 1 was about site manager participation. The last one was a request. For next week's working session, could Erin join? She seems closest to the operating model, and I'd like to walk through a few scenarios before we finalize sequencing. I read that line twice. Not because Denise had exposed Mark. She had not. She did not accuse him of anything. She probably had no idea there was anything to accuse him of. She had simply watched the meeting and decided who she trusted to answer the next set of questions. That was harder to explain away. A minute later, Mark appeared beside my desk. He had the email open on his phone. He smiled. Looks like you made an impression. I turned my chair toward him. Apparently. This is good. I waited. He said, I'll have you join the working session. Have me join. Like he was granting access to a meeting the client had specifically asked me to attend. Then he added, "I'll lead. You handle the technical detail." There it was again. The same line between us. He was the owner. I was the detail. Only now the client had started drawing that line somewhere else. The working session was supposed to last 45 minutes. It ran for almost 2 hours. Mark opened the call exactly the way he said he would. He welcomed everyone, reviewed the timeline, thanked Denise for sending her questions in advance, and spent the first 10 minutes talking about how seriously our company took continuity during the transition. Then Denise asked about Site 7. "Erin, can you pull up the version with the access dependency?" Mark was sharing his screen. There was a pause. Then he said, "Sure." "Erin?" I had the file open already. I shared it. Denise asked why we were holding Site 7 until the second transition wave, when its staffing score was better than 2 locations scheduled ahead of it. I explained the building access restriction. She asked whether moving the setup to Saturday would solve it. I explained why it would solve one problem and create another with the floating crew. She asked whether we could split the crew. I told her we could, but only if one site manager agreed to move a non-essential setup task into the following week. That turned into a 15-minute discussion. Mark mostly listened. There was nothing embarrassing about that. In a normal meeting, a manager should be able to let the person closest to the work answer detailed questions. The problem was that 3 days earlier, he had been the person closest to the work, at least according to him. By the end of the call, Denise had stopped prefacing questions with anyone's name. She would just ask something and wait. "Usually," I answered. When the question involved contract scope or reporting, Mark took it. When it involved how the transition would actually happen, it came to me. That division formed naturally. Nobody announced it. Nobody needed to. After the call, Mark sent me a message. "Nice work. Let's talk tomorrow about implementation support." I stared at the word support. I had started noticing words. Maybe too much. Support. Detail. Assist. Help. Words that sounded positive until you compared them with the work attached to them. The next morning, Mark came to my desk with a printed copy of the implementation calendar. "We got verbal confirmation," he said. "For the account?" He nodded. "Assuming procurement closes out the last couple of items, yes." I smiled despite everything. We had won it. I had spent weeks angry about the way Mark presented the work, but the work itself mattered to me. I wanted to see whether the model held up. I wanted to know whether the sequence I had built actually worked once real people started missing shifts and doors did not open when they were supposed to. Mark tapped the calendar. "So now the fun starts. What do you need?" That was automatic. "What do you need?" I almost laughed at myself. Mark pulled over the empty chair beside my desk. "I want you coordinating the day-to-day implementation." I looked at him. "Coordinating how much of it?" "The operational side. That's most of it." "Exactly." He smiled like he was giving me good news, and part of me heard it that way. This was what I had wanted. A major account. Real responsibility. Direct client exposure. The kind of project I could point to when an operations specialist role opened. He continued, "I'll stay on executive communication. Sheila will handle the commercial side. You own the readiness calls, site sequencing, staffing conflicts, escalation tracking, all that. You own." It was interesting how quickly ownership appeared once the work came with risk. I said, "Am I the implementation lead?" Mark tilted his head. "You'll be leading the implementation work." That's not what I asked. He looked toward the aisle behind me. People were working nearby, though nobody seemed to be listening. He lowered his voice. "Can we not turn every word into a negotiation?" "I'm asking what my role is." "Your role is to run the operational implementation. Under my current analyst role?" "For now." I nodded slowly. "And if there's a staffing conflict between 2 site managers?" "You make the recommendation. Can I approve a schedule change?" "We'll work through those." "With who?" "With me if needed." "What about overtime approval?" "Same thing." "So I'm accountable for the schedule, but I can't approve the changes needed to protect it." He leaned back. "Erin, I'm not trying to be difficult. It feels a little difficult. There it was. The thing I had spent my entire time under Mark trying not to be. Difficult. I looked at the calendar on my screen. The first transition was less than 4 weeks away. If I said yes, I knew what would happen. People would call me when something went wrong. Denise would call me. Site managers would call me. Leo would call me about staffing. I would be expected to make decisions quickly. And every time one of those decisions required authority I did not have, I would have to find Mark. If it went well, I would have supported a successful implementation. If it went badly, I would have run the operational implementation. I could already hear the difference. I said, I'm happy to do it if the assignment is formal. Mark rubbed his jaw. What does formal mean to you? Written scope, decision authority, who I'm accountable to. What I can approve without waiting for you. We're not creating a new job for a 2-month transition. I didn't ask for a new job. It sounds like you're asking for a title. I'm asking not to be responsible for something I don't have authority to run. He was quiet. I was scared. That part matters. It is easy to tell a story afterward and make the moment sound clean, like I had finally learned boundaries and delivered one perfect sentence. I had not. My hands were cold under the desk. Mark was still the person who wrote my performance review. He was still the person senior leadership would probably call first if I applied for another role. He could make the next year of my job easier, or harder. And I knew enough about workplaces to understand that people did not have to openly punish you to change your opportunities. They could just stop mentioning your name. I almost backed down. Then Mark said, "This is exactly the kind of exposure you said you wanted." I had never said that. Not to him. Not directly. That was another mistake I had made. I had spent a year behaving like I wanted advancement while refusing to say it clearly. So I corrected that too. Yes, I want the exposure. He looked surprised. I continued. I want to lead larger transitions. I want to move into an operations specialist role, and I want this project to count as evidence that I can do that. For once, Mark had no immediate answer. I said, so if I'm leading it, I need the role defined. If I'm supporting it as an analyst, that's fine too. But those are different assignments. He sat there for another few seconds. Then he stood. I need to think about how we structure it. Okay. He took the printed calendar with him. The minute he walked away, I felt sick. Not triumphant. Sick. I opened a spreadsheet and pretended to work for about 10 minutes while replaying every sentence I had said. Maybe I had pushed too hard. Maybe I should have accepted first and asked later. Maybe I had just turned the biggest opportunity I had ever been given into an argument over wording. That old instinct came back immediately. Make it easier. Fix the tension. Send him a message saying I was flexible. I opened the chat window, then closed it. Around noon, Leo stopped by. You look terrible. Thank you. Professional assessment. I told him what happened. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked, "Did you refuse the project?" "No." "Did you ask for more money?" "No." "Did you demand a promotion?" "No." "Then you asked who can make decisions." "Yes." That sounds pretty normal. It didn't feel normal. Because you usually say yes before anyone finishes the sentence. I gave him a look. He shrugged. Still true. I said, "Mark thinks I'm making it about a title. Are you?" I thought about it. A little. Okay. I expected him to tell me that was bad. He did not. He said, "Then own that too." I laughed once. "You're really enjoying this." "No, I'm hungry, and this conversation is happening between me and lunch." He started walking away. Then he stopped. For what it's worth, if you're the one getting calls at 6 in the morning, because Site 9 is missing 2 people, I'd want your name next to the job too. That afternoon, I got an email from Sheila. Not Mark. She asked whether I had 30 minutes the following morning. The meeting invite included Mark and our Director of Regional Operations, Kevin Morse. I barely slept. I told myself not to build a whole disaster out of a calendar invite. Then I built several. Maybe Mark had told them I was refusing work. Maybe Sheila thought I was becoming territorial with the client. Maybe Kevin was going to explain that junior employees did not get to define their own responsibilities. By 9 the next morning, I had prepared for all of them. Kevin joined from another office. Sheila was in person. Mark sat across from me. Kevin started. Mark brought up a question about ownership for the healthcare transition. I waited. Mark said, Erin wants clarity around her role if she's going to coordinate implementation. The way he said it was neutral. Not generous, not hostile, neutral. I appreciated that more than I expected. Kevin asked me, what's unclear right now? I explained it. I did not mention the presentation. I did not mention credit. I did not tell them Mark had called the framework his. I talked about the project. 11 sites. Shared support resources. Schedule changes. Overtime. Client-facing decisions. Escalation thresholds. If I'm coordinating those things, I said, I need to know which calls I can make and which ones require Mark's approval. Otherwise, we'll lose time every time something changes. Kevin nodded. Fair. That one word nearly knocked all the anxiety out of me. He asked Mark, what do you want to retain? Budget exceptions. Major staffing changes. Anything that moves a client date by more than a day. Kevin looked at me. Would that work? Yes. They spent another 15 minutes defining the edges. I could adjust sequencing inside an approved transition week. I could reassign the floating support crew according to the priority rules. I could approve limited overtime inside the project budget. Anything that changed a client commitment or exceeded the budget threshold went to Mark. Sheila would remain the commercial owner. Mark would remain executive sponsor. Then Kevin said, for internal purposes, let's call Erin temporary implementation lead through stabilization. I looked at Mark. He did not look at me. Kevin continued. That avoids confusion with the sites and with the client. It was not a promotion. My salary did not change. My permanent job title did not change. There was no applause. Kevin did not tell me he had discovered I was secretly brilliant. He just gave the work a name. Temporary implementation lead. That was enough. For then. After the meeting, Mark and I walked back toward our part of the office. He said, you got your clarity. I could not tell whether he was irritated. Probably. I said, yes. I hope you understand this comes with accountability too. I do. He looked at me. Good. Then he walked into his office. I thought I had won something. 3 weeks later, I learned what he meant. The first 2 site transitions went well. Not perfectly. Nothing in operations goes perfectly. A supply delivery arrived at the wrong entrance. A new hire misunderstood her start time. One site manager changed an access window without telling us. But the model worked. We moved resources around. We recovered. Denise joined the first 2 readiness calls and then started sending her local managers instead. That was a good sign. People stop attending meetings when they trust the system. By the 3rd week, I was starting to feel comfortable. Too comfortable. Site 6 had a staffing gap. One employee had called out for several days, and Leo told me we could cover it with overtime plus 1 person from the floating crew. At the same time, Site 8 was scheduled for setup work. According to our model, Site 6 took priority because it had active patient-facing service. That part was correct. My mistake came after. I assumed Site 8 could absorb the crew delay without affecting anything else. I had checked the readiness notes. I had checked staffing. I had checked access. I had not checked the vendor delivery window. Equipment for Site 8 was arriving that afternoon, and the vendor charged extra if the delivery crew had to remain on site beyond its booked window. By the time I realized it, the equipment was there and our setup crew was 40 minutes away. We paid unnecessary overtime on our side and an additional vendor charge. Not catastrophic. Still my mistake. The old version of me would have tried to soften it. I could have blamed the site notes. I could have said the delivery window had not been highlighted clearly. That was even partly true. Instead, on the next morning's internal call, I said, yesterday's Site 8 cost overrun came from my sequencing decision. I moved the floating crew based on staffing risk and missed the fixed delivery window. Mark was on the call. So was Kevin. Nobody rescued me, which, strangely, was exactly what I needed. Kevin asked, "What are you changing?" I added external vendor windows as a fixed dependency in the readiness check. We had access restrictions listed, but not vendor commitments. Mark asked, "Does that change any upcoming sites?" "Yes. Site 10 moves 1 day earlier inside the same week." "Client impact?" "No." "Budget impact?" "None expected." Mark said, "Okay." That was it. No one fired me. No one told me I was not ready to lead. We fixed the process. After the call, Mark messaged me. "Good correction." I stared at that message for a while too. Something had changed between us. It was not forgiveness. I was still angry about the presentation. He had never apologized. He never later admitted that he had presented my work as his. But once the implementation started, he also stopped pretending he was the person running the details. Maybe that was because the client made it impossible. Maybe it was because the role had been defined. Maybe it was because I had finally stopped helping him blur the line. Probably all three. The transition finished a little over 2 months after the first client presentation. 10 sites went on schedule. 1 moved by a day because of a staffing issue. We finished slightly above our original labor estimate and below the contingency budget. Nobody sent a company-wide announcement about me. There was no dramatic moment where Kevin called Mark into an office and stripped him of anything. Mark stayed my manager. That part surprises people when I tell the story. They expect the ending to be that he got fired. He did not. Workplaces are usually less satisfying than that. He did lose something. Not his job. The assumption that he could stand between me and the work and control how everyone understood it. Denise copied me directly on implementation questions. Sheila started asking for my input before transition timelines went to clients. Kevin asked me to sit in on planning for another account later that quarter. And when an operations specialist position opened a few months later, this time I told Mark before I submitted it, not because I needed his permission, because I wanted there to be no ambiguity. "I'm applying for the specialist role," I said. He leaned back in his chair. "I figured you might. I wanted you to hear it from me." He nodded. "You've got a stronger case now." Coming from him, that was almost funny. I said, "I know." He looked at me for a second. Then he smiled. Not warmly. Not coldly either. "Good luck." I did not get the job immediately. There were 2 other internal candidates with more experience. I made it to the final round. 6 weeks later, one of those candidates took the role. That hurt. I had changed how I worked, taken on the biggest project of my career, and part of me still expected the universe to reward the lesson quickly. It did not. But Kevin told me afterward that I was now being considered for specialist-level work and asked whether I would take another transition project in the meantime. I said yes. Then I asked what the role would be. He smiled. "Implementation lead." I smiled back. Then yes. The promotion came the following spring. By then, I had stopped thinking of the client meeting as the moment Mark got exposed. He never really did. Not in the way revenge stories usually promise. Nobody stood up and announced that I was the genius behind the plan. Nobody humiliated him. Nobody had to. Denise asked one practical question. Mark knew the presentation. I knew the system. And once people needed the system to work, that difference became difficult to hide. For a long time, I thought the lesson was that I should have put my name on the first deck. I should have. But that was not the bigger mistake. The bigger mistake was believing that asking for credit, scope, or authority made me difficult. I had spent years trying to be the person nobody had to worry about. I thought that made me professional. Sometimes it just made me convenient. The strangest part is that I never became less helpful. I still send people clean files. I still fix things that technically are not mine. I still care more about whether a plan works than who gets praised for the slide. I just stopped pretending those things were incompatible with saying, clearly, what I had done and what I was responsible for. Because good work does not always speak for itself. Sometimes you have to be willing to put your name next to it before somebody else does. If you were in my position, would you have corrected Mark in front of the client? Or handled it the way I did?